Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. Part 3, Evaluating Judicial Review. In the last lecture, we left off on this question. Why should we have judicial review at all? It's a provocative question we're going to talk about, Professor Peterson. What are some cases in American history that cast doubt on the desirability of judicial review?
Well, the best case is the Dred Scott decision, which was decided in 1857, Chris. That was probably the worst decision the Supreme Court ever made. 4 years later, the Civil War breaks out, and many people say that this decision was an important factor contributing to the outbreak of the Civil War. Justice Roger Taney was the Chief Justice at the time, and he was a Southerner, and he heard a case that Southerners cared about very deeply.
What was the context for this case?
Well, the Dred Scott decision was filed, is the result of a suit that was filed by the slaveholder of Dred Scott. And this slaveholder lived in Missouri, and he went to the territory of Minnesota. Minnesota wasn't a state at the time, it was a territory, which was under federal jurisdiction. And in the state of Minnesota, or the territory of Minnesota, there was a rule that said that you couldn't have slaves. Well, in Missouri, you could have slaves. So Dred Scott says, I'm free. I'm in Minnesota. I'm free. And his owner said, oh, no, you're not free, because if you're free, then I will be deprived of my property without due process of law. And the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It's pretty ironic because, of course, Dred Scott was being deprived of his liberty. But then, of course, he wasn't a person, so that didn't count. So the slaveholder said, no person shall be deprived, that's me. And that was the Dred Scott case that the Supreme Court had to decide.
And what did the Supreme Court decide in the case?
Well, they agreed with the slaveholder. They said that actually the Missouri Compromise, which was passed in 1820, was unconstitutional. That was a law that said that all the territory north of the line that is just on the border of Missouri, all that property in the new part of the territory that's been acquired by the United States as a result of winning the Mexican War and other acquisitions that took place, all that territory that's above that line is going to be free. And all the territory below that line is going to be a slave state. And Missouri is going to be the only exception. They're going to let Missouri remain a slave state, even though it's north of that line. Well, that, of course, made Dred Scott free when he went to Minnesota. And the Supreme Court said, no, that law violates the Constitution because it leads to the deprivation of property ownership simply because a person crosses a particular boundary. Well, that might make some legal sense in some circles, but it was a terrible decision because it confirmed the worst fears of the Northerners, that all the United States would become slave country. There would no longer be a distinction between free parts of the United States and slave states. So it was a pretty dreadful decision.
What is another landmark case that casts doubt on judicial review?
Well, another case that comes after the Civil War, you might say, okay, so we understand that Dred Scott decision was a bad decision and cast doubt on whether or not the Supreme Court should have the power of judicial review. But that whole issue was settled in the Civil War, and so since then, maybe the Supreme Court should have the power of judicial review. But then there is the case of Lochner v. New York, which comes up in 1905, where the Supreme Court declares that there is a state law that regulates working conditions. And it was decided by the Supreme Court that that deprived workers of the freedom to work as many hours a day as they wanted to. So it involved bakers. Lochner was a baker, and they were working more than 40 hours a week. And New York state law said that no, bakers and other workers could not work more than a 40-hour week. So when this case was decided, you got a new ruling that said that any attempt to control working conditions in factories would violate the U.S. Constitution.
In this case, while the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Lochner, saying that the New York state law regulating working conditions is unconstitutional, Oliver Wendell Holmes penned a notable dissent. What did he say?
Well, the way he put it was, it's settled by various decisions of this court that state constitutions and state laws may regulate life in many ways. This is not unusual to have regulations of human behavior. A constitution is not intended to embody a particular economic theory. This is the economic theory of laissez-faire, that you should let the market decide everything. You shouldn't interfere with the marketplace. And Holmes said that's a really strange way of interpreting the Constitution. You have to see that the Constitution was made for people of fundamentally differing views, and you should be very careful before you declare laws unconstitutional.
These two cases cast doubt on the desirability of judicial review. And as you mentioned, Marbury versus Madison, the first case that established judicial review itself, was a bizarre case. So why do we have judicial review today?
Well, that's a good question, Chris. And there are people who say that perhaps judicial review should just be abandoned. But the Supreme Court has been, over the years, generally very cautious in exercising its power of judicial review. Only about 200 federal laws have been declared unconstitutional. Many more state laws have been declared unconstitutional, but as we shall discuss later, there's a case for that, for exercising closer scrutiny of state laws. But when it comes to laws passed by Congress, the Supreme Court has been pretty cautious. Now, there was one point in American history, the New Deal, the 1930s, the period of the Great Depression, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, working with Congress, passed a lot of new social legislation. And the Supreme Court, for a while, was declaring these laws unconstitutional. And that led to a great conflict that we're going to be talking about. So there was this great exception to the general pattern, but overall the Supreme Court has been pretty respectful of the power of Congress. And when it does exercise the power of judicial review, it's usually using it in a way consistent with what the country expects. So the power of judicial review has been used cautiously enough by the courts that they've always been able to protect that authority. And some people say that the court has a remarkable instinct for its own self-preservation. And so its use of the judicial review is carefully exercised. Now, there's another way of putting it, and that's the bartender, Mr. Dooley, who was a cartoon character at the turn of the century in the early 1910s, 1905, and he always came up with one-liners that put it better than all the words that can be constructed around issues. And he says, well, the Supreme Court follows the election returns. In other words, the Supreme Court listens to what the public wants, just like presidents do and just like Congress does.
You alluded to this. Is there a strong argument for judicial review with respect to state laws?
Well, if you follow Oliver Wendell Holmes' thinking, yes, there is. He said, I don't think the United States would come to an end if we lost our power to declare an act of Congress void. So he's basically saying, we don't really need judicial review for acts of Congress. But he says, I do think the Union would be imperiled if we could not make that declaration as to the laws of the several states. For one in my place sees how often a local policy prevails with those who are not trained to national views. Now, there's a certain amount of arrogance there, but there's a truth to it as well, that if you didn't have judicial review of state laws, you might have some states going off in a direction completely different from the rest of the country. So we do have to have some kind of a mechanism that unifies the country, and the judicial review exercised over state laws is a very important political power.
Professor Peterson, how would you summarize the case for judicial review?
Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes probably did a pretty good job of doing that. He said that we could have laws of Congress declared constitutional in every case and still have a viable political system. So there are some questions about judicial review as it applies to congressional legislation. But some people say, consider the importance that the Supreme Court is for the protection of civil liberties and minority voices. So we need to give that topic careful consideration before we draw firm conclusions. Nonetheless, on the other side, we have to be cautious about giving unelected justices too much political power. So that's with respect to laws of Congress. With respect to the laws of the states and gubernatorial actions, there is a powerful case for judicial review. It is the way in which we maintain a unified nation.
That ends our discussion of judicial review. In the next lecture, we will move on to federalism.